my rich wife suddenly announced after I lost my job. From now on, we're splitting everything 50-50. I'm only responsible for myself. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just looked at her calmly and said, okay. So there I was, sitting across from my wife Claudia at Le Bernardin. Yeah, that pretentious fish palace where they charge you $40 for what's basically fancy tuna tartare. Thinking this dinner was her way of cheering me up after getting canned from my marketing job earlier that week. Boy, was I about as wrong as a weather forecast in Florida. The candlelight was doing that thing where it made her look all ethereal and goddess-like, which should have been my first red flag. Claudia only broke out the soft lighting when she was about to drop some nuclear-level news. Last time she set up candles like this, she told me her mother was moving in for just a few weeks. That was 8 months ago, and Patricia still treats our guest bathroom like her personal spa retreat. Honey, she said, twirling her wine glass like she was conducting a symphony orchestra, I've been thinking about us. About our marriage. Now, any guy who's been married longer than 5 minutes knows that when your wife starts a conversation with, I've been thinking about us, you're about to get hit with something that'll make a freight train feel like a gentle breeze. I braced myself for the usual suspects. Couples therapy, a trial separation, or maybe she wanted to discuss having kids again. Which, let's be real, was about as likely as me winning the lottery while getting struck by lightning. But nope, Claudia had something way more creative in mind. I think we should try a 50-50 arrangement, she announced, cutting into her lobster with the precision of a surgeon and the confidence of someone who just solved world hunger. You know, split everything right down the middle. Bills, chores, responsibilities, everything equal. I nearly choked on my overpriced wine. 50-50? Like roommates. Exactly, she beamed, like she'd just pitched the next big streaming hit. Think about it. Married but divided. We keep all the benefits of being married, but we eliminate the, traditional expectations and dependencies. Traditional expectations. That's rich coming from someone who hasn't done her own laundry since Obama was in office. But I kept my mouth shut because, honestly, I was too busy trying to process what the hell was happening. Here I was, freshly unemployed, ego bruised like a dropped peach, and my loving wife of 7 years was essentially demoting me from husband to guy who pays half the rent and occasionally sees her naked. So, I said, trying to keep my voice steady while my brain was doing mental gymnastics that would make Simone Biles jealous. When you say 50-50, you mean? Everything, she said, taking another delicate bite of her lobster, which, by the way, cost more than my car payment. Rent, utilities, groceries, dining out, entertainment. We split it all equally. No more you paying for everything just because you're the husband. The irony wasn't lost on me that she was explaining this while I was currently picking up the tab for our $160 dinner. But hey, who's keeping track, right? And what brought this on? I asked, because apparently I'm a glutton for punishment. Claudia set down her fork and gave me that look. You know the one. It's part pity, part frustration, and part, I've already made up my mind, so this conversation is really just a formality. She'd perfected that look over the years, usually right before she bought something expensive or decided we needed to redecorate the living room for the 3rd time in 2 years. Well, with your job situation, she said, and I could practically hear the air quotes around situation, I think it's time we both became more independent, more self-sufficient. Self-sufficient. Right. This from the woman who calls me at work. Well, used to call me at work to ask me to look up movie times for her because she couldn't figure out how to use Fandango. The same woman who once spent 20 minutes on the phone with tech support because she couldn't get Netflix to work, only to discover she'd been trying to watch TV with the remote upside down. But you know what? Instead of losing my shit right there in front of the snooty waiters and the other couples pretending their own marriages weren't also held together with duct tape and shared Netflix passwords, I did something that surprised even me. I smiled. Okay, I said, reaching for my wine glass with the calm of a Zen master who'd just achieved enlightenment. 50-50 it is. Claudia blinked, clearly thrown off by my lack of dramatic reaction. She'd probably rehearsed this whole scene in her head, complete with me getting all emotional and begging her to reconsider. Instead, I was sitting there nodding like she'd just suggested we try a new pizza place. Okay, she repeated, like I'd just agreed to donate a kidney. Sure, I said, taking a sip of wine that suddenly tasted like victory. Sounds fair. Equal partnership and all that. The truth is, while my mouth was saying, okay, my brain was already 3 moves ahead, sketching out what I was mentally calling Operation Petty Revenge. If Claudia wanted to play house like we were college roommates, then by God, I was going to be the best damn roommate she'd ever had. The kind that follows every rule to the letter and then some. She wanted 50-50? She was about to get 50-50 in ways she never imagined. The rest of dinner passed in a weird bubble of forced normalcy, with Claudia chattering about her day at the boutique marketing firm where she consulted on social media strategies, which basically meant she got paid to tell people what filters to use on Instagram. Meanwhile, I was doing mental math, calculating exactly what half of everything would look like. Half the mortgage, half the utilities, half the groceries, half the dog food for Biscuit, our golden retriever who was currently living his best life thinking he had 2 devoted parents instead of 2 people about to turn into the world's most passive-aggressive roommates. By the time we got home, I was practically humming. Claudia kept giving me weird looks, like she was waiting for the other shoe to drop, but I just kissed her goodnight like nothing had changed. Because in a way, nothing had changed. We were still married, still living in the same overpriced condo in Brooklyn Heights, still sharing the same bed, the same bathroom, the same suffocating routine we'd been stuck in for years. The only difference was that now we had rules. Clear, explicit, 50-50 rules. And if there's one thing I've learned in my 34 years on this planet, it's that I'm really, really good at following rules. Especially when following them to the letter drives other people absolutely insane. Game on, Claudia. The next morning, I woke up at my usual 6:30 a.m., but instead of stumbling to the kitchen like a caffeine-deprived zombie to start the daily ritual of making Claudia her perfect cup of coffee, 2 sugars, splash of oat milk, heated to exactly 165 degrees because apparently 160 is lukewarm swill and 170 is molten lava, I did something revolutionary. I stayed in bed. I laid there listening to the sounds of our morning routine. Except this time, I was experiencing it from the perspective of a paying tenant rather than a devoted husband. The shower running, that's 50% of the water bill right there. The hairdryer going for 20 minutes straight. Hello, electric company. And the unmistakable sound of Claudia's heels clicking across our hardwood floors as she prepared for another day of telling millennials, which Instagram filter best captured their authentic brand voice. By 7:15, right on schedule, I heard her bedroom door open with that particular confidence that only comes from someone who's never questioned whether breakfast would be waiting for them. For 7 years, I'd been her personal short-order cook, whipping up everything from elaborate egg benedict on weekends to simple toast and coffee on busy weekdays. I'd learned her preferences better than any 5-star hotel concierge. How she liked her eggs, over easy, but not too runny. Her toast, golden brown, not blonde, definitely not dark, and her fruit, cut into perfect bite-sized pieces because apparently she wasn't raised by wolves. But today was the dawn of the 50-50 era, baby. I heard her heels clicking down the hallway, then pause at the kitchen threshold. The silence that followed was so complete, so profound, that I could practically hear her brain trying to process what she was seeing. Or rather, what she wasn't seeing. The kitchen table, which for 7 years had been her morning altar complete with steaming coffee, perfectly arranged breakfast, and whatever fruit was in season artfully displayed like we were running a bed and breakfast in Vermont, was as bare as my bank account after last night's dinner. I counted the seconds. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. What the hell? There it was. Right on schedule. I slipped on my robe, the ratty terry cloth one she'd been nagging me to throw away for 3 years because it looks like something a serial killer would wear, and padded into the kitchen with the casual air of someone who had absolutely nowhere to be and all the time in the world to get there. Claudia was standing in the middle of our kitchen looking like someone had just told her that avocado toast was actually bad for you. She was already dressed for work in one of those outfits that cost more than my monthly car payment. A silk blouse that probably required a PhD in fabric care, tailored pants that fit her like they were painted on, and heels that could double as weapons in a zombie apocalypse. Her hair was perfect, her makeup was flawless, and she was staring at our empty kitchen table like it had personally betrayed her. "Where's my coffee?" she asked, and I swear I could hear the italics in her voice. I opened the refrigerator, grabbed a carton of orange juice, and poured myself a glass with the deliberate slowness of someone savoring every moment of this interaction. Coffee? Oh, that's at Starbucks. I believe your usual order is under your name. Grande oat milk latte, 2 pumps of vanilla, extra hot. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again like a fish trying to figure out how to breathe air. What are you talking about? Well, I said, taking a leisurely sip of my orange juice. Remember last night? 50-50 arrangement? I figured that included beverages and meal preparation services. So if you want coffee, you'll need to either make it yourself or purchase it from a qualified establishment. I recommend the Starbucks on Montague Street. Their baristas have been professionally trained in the art of not burning coffee beans. The look she gave me could have melted steel. Are you kidding me right now? Do I look like I'm kidding? I gestured to my serial killer bathrobe and bedhead hair. This is me being completely serious about our new arrangement. Equal partners, equal responsibilities, remember? She stared at me for another few seconds, probably trying to decide whether to laugh, cry, or call a divorce lawyer. Then she spun on her designer heel and marched to the coffee maker, a fancy Italian espresso machine that she'd insisted we needed but had never actually used herself because, and I quote, "That's what husbands are for." Watching Claudia try to operate that coffee machine was like watching someone attempt brain surgery with a spoon. She pressed buttons randomly, turned dials with the confidence of someone who'd seen me do it 1,000 times but had never actually paid attention to the process. The machine made a series of angry beeping sounds, like it was personally offended by her technique. "How do you make this thing work?" she demanded, shooting me a look that suggested I was being deliberately unhelpful by not jumping in to rescue her. "Well," I said, settling into one of our kitchen chairs like I was about to watch a really good movie. "There's usually a manual. Should be in that drawer over there. Or you could Google it. I believe the model number is on the back." She yanked open the drawer with enough force to rattle the silverware and started digging through our collection of appliance manuals, takeout menus, and random batteries that may or may not still work. Her perfectly manicured nails were now chipped from her aggressive drawer excavation, and I could see a small stress vein starting to pulse in her forehead. Meanwhile, I noticed movement outside our kitchen window. Jerry, our 67-year-old neighbor who'd retired from fixing cars, but apparently not from fixing himself a front-row seat to other people's drama, was pretending to water his plants on his fire escape. Jerry was the kind of guy who could fix a carburetor with a paperclip and some electrical tape, but he also had the social awareness of someone who'd spent 40 years listening to people complain about their problems while he worked on their cars. Jerry caught my eye through the window and raised his coffee mug in what was clearly a salute. Then he gave me a thumbs up that was so enthusiastic, I thought he might fall off his fire escape. I nodded back, trying to keep my expression neutral while internally high-fiving myself. Back in the kitchen, Claudia had found the manual and was flipping through it with the frantic energy of someone who'd just realized they might actually have to learn how to take care of themselves. The espresso machine continued to beep at her disapprovingly. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, stabbing at buttons like she was trying to defuse a bomb. "I don't have time for this. I have a meeting at 9. I said, checking my phone with the casual air of someone whose biggest concern was whether to have cereal or toast for breakfast. "Traffic's pretty heavy on the BQE this morning. Might want to factor that into your timeline." She shot me another death glare, then apparently decided that learning to operate complex machinery was not in her job description. She grabbed her purse, checked her reflection in the toaster, because God forbid she leave the house with a single hair out of place, and headed for the door. "Fine," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone that women use when they want you to know that nothing about this situation is actually fine. "I'll get coffee on the way to work." "Great idea," I said cheerfully. "Oh, and Claudia, don't forget, if you're planning to use any of the breakfast items in the fridge, we should probably work out a cost-sharing system. I'm thinking we could do a spreadsheet. Track usage, calculate proportional costs, maybe set up a monthly reconciliation process." She paused with her hand on the doorknob, her shoulders tensing like she was about to turn around and say something that would probably require me to sleep on the couch. But then she seemed to think better of it, took a deep breath, and walked out without another word. The door slammed with enough force to rattle the windows, and I heard her heels clicking rapidly down the hallway toward the elevator. A few seconds later, I heard the elevator ding, and then blessed silence. I finished my orange juice, waved at Jerry, who was still pretending to water his plants while clearly eavesdropping on our domestic drama, and started making myself some actual breakfast. Scrambled eggs, toast, bacon, the works. The kind of breakfast I used to make for both of us back when I thought being a good husband meant anticipating her needs before she even knew she had them. As I cooked, I thought about the beautiful irony of the situation. For years, Claudia had taken my morning routine for granted. She'd never once thanked me for the coffee, never acknowledged the perfectly timed breakfast, never seemed to notice that I'd been getting up 30 minutes early just to make sure her day started smoothly. But now she was about to discover what the rest of the world already knew. Good coffee costs money, making breakfast takes time, and taking care of yourself is actually work. I took a picture of my breakfast and sent it to my buddy Mike with the caption, "Day 1 of the new marriage arrangement. So far, so good." His response came back immediately. "Dude, you're playing with fire." Maybe, but at least I wasn't the one who had to figure out how to work an espresso machine before my first meeting of the day. Game on, indeed. 3 days into our brave new world of marital equality, I was starting to think Claudia might actually let this whole 50-50 thing slide into the background like her New Year's resolution to do yoga, or that time she swore she was going to learn French. You know how it is. People say a lot of things when they're feeling dramatic, but then reality kicks in and suddenly making your own coffee every morning starts to seem like a lot more work than just accepting the status quo. Boy, was I wrong. I should have known something was up when I came home from my daily unemployment ritual, which consisted of sending out resumes, getting rejected by companies I wouldn't have wanted to work for anyway, and watching way too much daytime television, and found Claudia sitting at our dining room table with her laptop open, wearing her business mode face and surrounded by enough paperwork to choke a CPA. She looked up when I walked in, and I swear she had that gleam in her eye that women get when they've figured out how to reorganize your entire life without asking for your input. It's the same look she had when she decided we needed to renovate the bathroom, or when she announced we were switching to organic everything, or that time she convinced me we should get Biscuit professionally groomed every 6 weeks, because he's part of our family's image. "Perfect timing," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her like she was conducting a board meeting, and I was some middle management schlub who'd been called in to explain why the quarterly numbers were down. "We need to talk." I set down my keys and tried to read her expression. After 7 years of marriage, I'd become pretty fluent in Claudia's various moods, but this one was new territory. She looked like a cross between a Fortune 500 CEO and a kindergarten teacher who was about to explain why finger painting wasn't just fun, but actually a crucial part of childhood development. "About what?" I asked, though I was pretty sure I already knew where this was going. "Our arrangement," she said, turning her laptop around so I could see the screen. "I've been thinking about efficiency." And there it was, a spreadsheet so detailed, so meticulously organized, that it probably qualified as a work of art in some very specific, very nerdy circles. The header read, "Proposal for Household Efficiency" in 18-point bold font, and below that was a table that broke down our entire life into categories, subcategories, and what appeared to be actual mathematical formulas. I leaned forward to get a better look, and my jaw practically hit the table. This wasn't just a simple 50-50 split. This was a comprehensive analysis of our domestic economy that would have made an accounting firm jealous. She had columns for everything: rent, utilities, groceries, household supplies, entertainment, dining out, transportation, and something labeled miscellaneous lifestyle expenses that I was afraid to ask about. "Jesus Christ, Claudia," I said, scrolling through what appeared to be multiple tabs of data. "Did you hire a consultant for this?" "I did it myself," she said with the pride of someone who'd just solved climate change. "I spent all day yesterday tracking our expenses from the last 6 months, categorizing everything, and calculating the optimal distribution of financial responsibility." Optimal distribution of financial responsibility. She was talking about our marriage like it was a supply chain management problem. I kept scrolling through the spreadsheet, and the deeper I got, the more ridiculous it became. She'd literally itemized everything down to the individual rolls of toilet paper, assigned them cost values, and calculated usage rates based on what she called historical consumption patterns. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a cell that showed $47.23. That's your monthly share of groceries based on caloric intake and dietary preferences. I factored in the fact that you eat more protein and I consume more organic produce, which tends to be pricier per pound. I stared at the number, then at her, then back at the number. You calculated my caloric intake? I used the MyFitnessPal data from your phone, she said matter-of-factly. Like this was completely normal behavior and not the kind of thing that would make most people change their locks. Plus, I did some research on average male metabolic rates for someone your age and activity level. Activity level? Right. Because apparently my current activity level of lying on the couch applying for jobs while stress-eating leftover pizza was now part of our household economic model. But wait, there was more. She'd broken down the utilities into subcategories that would have impressed the Department of Energy. Electricity was divided between appliance usage, lighting, and climate control. Water was split between showering, laundry, dishwashing, and what she'd labeled as recreational consumption, which I assumed meant my habit of taking long baths when I was feeling particularly sorry for myself. And here, she said, clicking to another tab, is where it gets interesting. Entertainment expenses. I scrolled down and nearly choked on my own spit. She'd actually billed me $7.99 for what she called shared Wi-Fi enjoyment, and another $12.50 for Netflix account proportional usage, based on our respective viewing hours. Apparently, she'd been tracking our screen time like we were teenagers with helicopter parents. You're charging me for Netflix? I asked. Not charging, she corrected. Cost sharing. Look, I watch mostly documentaries and foreign films, which have lower bandwidth requirements. You stream action movies and sports, which require more data. It only makes sense that you'd pay a larger percentage of the subscription cost. I continued scrolling through her digital masterpiece and discovered she'd managed to assign monetary values to things I didn't even know could be monetized. There was a line item for morning coffee preparation services valued at $3.50 per cup, meal planning and grocery list creation at $25 per week, and something called ambient atmosphere maintenance that apparently covered her scented candles, background music, and the general effort required to make our home feel welcoming. But my personal favorite was the section labeled Pet Care Distribution. She'd calculated that Biscuit spent 60% of his time in communal areas, 25% of his time in our bedroom, and 15% of his time on the balcony, and had used these percentages to determine how much each of us owed for his food, toys, vet bills, and grooming. She'd even factored in the fact that I was the one who usually walked him in the mornings, which apparently earned me a $12 monthly credit for canine exercise services. This is insane, I said, which probably wasn't the most diplomatic response, but honestly, I was looking at a document that treated our marriage like a business partnership between two corporations. It's not insane, Claudia said, and I could hear that edge in her voice that meant she was getting defensive. It's fair. It's transparent. It's exactly what we agreed on. Everything 50-50, but calculated properly, so there's no ambiguity or resentment. No ambiguity or resentment. Right. Because nothing says healthy relationship like billing your spouse for their portion of the water bill based on shower duration analysis. I kept reading, and the more I read, the more I realized that Claudia had essentially turned our marriage into the world's most passive-aggressive accounting exercise. She'd found a way to quantify every single aspect of our domestic life and assign it a price tag. It was like she'd taken the concept of emotional labor and ran it through a business school cost-benefit analysis. And look at this section, she said, clicking to what appeared to be the final tab. Projected monthly expenses with the new system. This was where things got really interesting. According to her calculations, my monthly household participation fee would be $1,247.83, which covered everything from my share of the mortgage to my portion of the premium cable package we'd never actually agreed I wanted. Her portion, meanwhile, was $1,251.16, a difference she attributed to her higher personal care product consumption and her habit of keeping the apartment at what she called optimal comfort temperature year-round. So let me get this straight, I said, leaning back in my chair and trying to process the sheer audacity of what I was looking at. You want me to pay you $1,247.83 per month to live in the apartment I've been helping to pay for since we moved in together. Not pay me, she said. Pay your fair share of our combined household expenses. I've set up a shared checking account where we'll each deposit our monthly contributions, and all household expenses will be paid from that account. A shared checking account. Of course, because what this situation really needed was more bureaucracy. I looked at the spreadsheet again, then at Claudia, then back at the spreadsheet. And you know what? I started laughing. Not a polite chuckle or an uncomfortable giggle, but a full-on belly laugh that made Biscuit lift his head from his dog bed to see what was so funny. What's so amusing? Claudia asked, and I could tell she was getting pissed that I wasn't taking her masterpiece seriously. Nothing, I said, wiping my eyes. It's just, this is exactly what I needed to see. Because here's the thing. While Claudia had been busy turning our relationship into a graduate-level economics project, I'd been sitting around feeling sorry for myself and wondering if maybe she had a point about the whole equality thing. Maybe I had been taking advantage of our traditional setup. Maybe I should feel guilty about letting her carry more of the emotional load. But this spreadsheet, this beautiful, psychotic, ridiculously detailed spreadsheet, this was proof that Claudia hadn't been thinking about fairness or equality at all. She'd been thinking about control, about finding a way to micromanage our relationship while making it look like she was being reasonable. So what do you think? She asked, clearly expecting me to be impressed by her thoroughness. I think, I said, closing her laptop gently and giving her my biggest, most genuine smile, that this is absolutely brilliant. Her face lit up like I'd just told her she'd won the lottery. Really? Oh yeah, I said. In fact, I'm so inspired by your approach that I think I'm going to create my own spreadsheet. You know, to make sure I'm tracking my contributions accurately. That night, after Claudia had gone to bed feeling smug about her organizational skills, I sat down at my own computer and opened up Google Sheets. If she wanted to play the accounting game, then by God, I was going to play it better than she ever imagined. I titled my spreadsheet Marital Liquidation Analysis and started with 2 simple columns: services previously provided at no charge and market value assessment. Coffee preparation, $3.50 per cup, times 365 days, times 7 years. Meal planning and grocery shopping, $25 per week, times 52 weeks, times 7 years. Laundry services, $15 per load, times 3 loads per week, times 365 days, times 7 years. By the time I was done, I had a 7-year invoice for services rendered that would have made a luxury hotel concierge weep with envy. But my favorite addition was the final section: penalty fees for retroactive policy changes. Because if Claudia wanted to treat our marriage like a business contract, then she was about to learn that unilateral contract modifications usually come with some pretty hefty fees. Game on, indeed. You know how in those old Cold War movies, they always show Berlin divided by that massive concrete wall, with families literally separated overnight, and people risking their lives just to cross from one side to the other? Well, our 1,200 square foot condo in Brooklyn Heights was about to become the domestic equivalent of that historical nightmare. Except instead of communism versus capitalism, it was my side versus her side. And instead of barbed wire, we had masking tape. It started innocently enough. The morning after Claudia's spreadsheet presentation, which, by the way, she'd printed out in color and laminated like some kind of deranged restaurant menu, I woke up to find her in the living room with a measuring tape, a level, and enough blue painter's tape to redecorate the Pentagon. "What are you doing?" I asked, though I was pretty sure I didn't want to know the answer. "Establishing boundaries," she said without looking up from her work. She was on her hands and knees, running a perfectly straight line of tape right down the middle of our living room, from the kitchen entrance to the sliding door that led to our balcony. If we're going to do this 50-50 thing properly, we need clear delineation of personal space. I watched in fascination as she worked with the precision of a surveyor mapping out property lines for a multi-million-dollar real estate deal. She'd even brought out the little step stool we usually used for changing light bulbs, so she could make sure the tape line continued at the proper height along the walls. "Claudia," I said, "you're literally dividing our apartment in half." "Exactly," she said, standing back to admire her handiwork. "You're half my half. No more confusion about whose responsibility is what." And that's how I found myself living in the Berlin Wall of broken marriages. The division, I had to admit, was mathematically impressive. Claudia had measured everything, and I mean everything. Square footage, window access, electrical outlets, even the number of decorative elements per side. She'd calculated it all to ensure that we each got exactly 600 square feet of living space, which sounds fair in theory, but becomes absolutely insane when you realize that's not how real life works. Her half, which, naturally, she'd claimed first, was like something out of a Pinterest board titled Modern Woman's Urban Sanctuary. She had the good couch, the one we'd spent 3 months shopping for because apparently not all white leather is created equal. She had the marble coffee table that cost more than most people's monthly rent. She had the fancy floor lamp that required a PhD in engineering to assemble and the bookshelf filled with all those novels she bought, but never read because they looked intellectual. Her side also had the big window with the view of the promenade and the harbor, which she'd somehow calculated was worth exactly the same as my window that looked out onto the air shaft between buildings. According to her math, a view of the water was equivalent to a view of Mrs. Chun hanging her laundry, because all windows provide equal natural light access. My half looked like what would happen if a college dorm room and a garage sale had a baby and then abandoned it at a bus station. I had the recliner that I'd inherited from my dad, the one where you had to kick the side to get the footrest to stay up. I had the TV stand we'd bought at IKEA during our first year together, back when we thought assembling furniture together was romantic instead of a relationship stress test. And I had the floor lamp that only worked when Mercury was in retrograde, and you held your mouth just right while flipping the switch. But here's where it got really weird. Claudia took this whole division thing seriously. Like, scary seriously. She didn't just put tape on the floor and call it a day. She treated that line like it was an international border complete with customs enforcement. The first time I crossed over to her side to grab the remote control, which had somehow ended up on her coffee table, she gave me a look that could have frozen hell over. "Excuse me," she said, "but I believe that's my remote control." "It's our remote control," I said. "For our TV. The TV is on your side," she pointed out. But the remote was on my side, which means I was using it. If you want to control the television, you need to ask permission to access my territory. My territory. She was talking about our living room like we were neighboring countries negotiating a peace treaty. "Fine," I said, because I was curious to see how far she'd take this ridiculous game. "May I please have permission to retrieve the remote control from your sovereign territory?" "Permission granted," she said formally, "but please make it quick. I don't want you loitering in my space." Loitering. In the apartment I'd been living in for 5 years. But if I thought the remote control incident was the peak of this insanity, I was dead wrong. Because Claudia, it turned out, was just getting warmed up. The next morning, I discovered that she'd extended the territorial division to include cleaning responsibilities. I woke up to the sound of the vacuum cleaner, which normally would have been a pleasant surprise since vacuuming usually fell into the category of things I'd get around to eventually. But when I came out to investigate, I found Claudia pushing our Dyson in the most bizarre pattern I'd ever seen. She was vacuuming only her half of the apartment. Not just approximately her half, but exactly her half, following that blue tape line with the precision of someone who'd been trained in military drill formations. She'd vacuum right up to the tape, then stop abruptly and maneuver the vacuum back to cover another section of her territory. "What are you doing?" I asked, though by this point I probably should have just started a running list of ridiculous questions I found myself asking on a daily basis. "Cleaning my space," she said, shutting off the vacuum. 50-50, remember? I'm responsible for maintaining my half. You're responsible for yours. I looked down at the floor, and it was like looking at a before and after advertisement for carpet cleaning services. Her side was pristine, with perfect vacuum lines running parallel to the tape boundary. My side looked like it had been through a small tornado, with dog hair, dust bunnies, and what appeared to be remnants from the bag of chips I'd eaten while watching Netflix 3 days ago. I started to say crazy, but then I realized this was actually kind of brilliant in its pettiness. "That's very thorough of you." She smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd just made a point without having to explain it. But the real masterpiece came later that evening when I discovered what she'd done to our bedroom. Now, I should mention that our bedroom had always been neutral territory in the apartment. Even during our worst fights, the bedroom remained a shared space where we could at least pretend we were still a functional couple. It was where we kept our clothes, where we slept, where we had conversations that didn't involve whose turn it was to take out the trash. Not anymore. I walked in to find that Claudia had extended her tape line right down the middle of our king-size bed. Not just across the floor, but literally up and over the mattress, creating what looked like the world's most passive-aggressive marriage counseling exercise. "Really?" I said. "Really?" She replied from her side of the bed, where she was arranging her pillows with the precision of a hotel housekeeper. 50-50 extends to sleeping arrangements too. "That's your half. This is mine." I looked at my half of the bed, which, thanks to the way the room was laid out, was also the side closest to the door, meaning I'd have to crawl over her every time I wanted to get up in the middle of the night. "And what happens if I need to get up to use the bathroom?" I asked. "Then you ask permission to cross my airspace, just like with any other territorial boundary." Territorial boundary. Airspace. She was turning our marriage into a geopolitics class. But you know what? I wasn't even mad anymore. I was impressed. Claudia had managed to take the concept of 50-50 and turn it into performance art. She was so committed to this bit that she was literally sleeping on half a bed just to make a point. And that's when I realized I needed to step up my own game. The next day, while Claudia was at work telling people how to optimize their social media presence, I went shopping. Not for groceries or household supplies, but for the tools of territorial warfare. I bought my own measuring tape, my own painter's tape, in red, because if we were going to have competing territorial claims, we might as well color coordinate, and a label maker that I was probably going to have way too much fun with. When she got home that evening, she found that I'd made some improvements to our living situation. I'd labeled everything on my side of the apartment with helpful tags: Dave's chair, Dave's TV, Dave's portion of electrical outlet, and my personal favorite, Dave's 50% of shared air supply. But the real stroke of genius was what I'd done in the kitchen. Since Claudia's territorial line ran right through the middle of our kitchen table, I'd taken the liberty of removing my half of the table entirely. Just sawed it right down the middle and moved my portion to my side of the apartment. Now we had two half tables, sitting on opposite sides of a blue tape line, like the world's most ridiculous modern art installation. Claudia walked in, saw the devastation, and just stood there for a full minute trying to process what had happened to our furniture. "You cut our table in half," she said. I moved my half of our table to my side. I corrected. "Your half is still exactly where it always was. 50-50, remember?" She looked at her half table, which was now basically just a wooden triangle balanced precariously on two legs, and then at my half table, which I'd supplemented with a cardboard box to make it functional again. "This is insane," she said. "This," I replied, settling into my recliner and putting my feet up on my half ottoman, "is exactly what you wanted." Even Biscuit, who had been watching this whole domestic disaster unfold with the patient resignation of someone who'd seen too many of our arguments over the years, had apparently chosen a side. Every night, he'd cross over to my territory and sleep at the foot of my half of the bed, which I took as a victory in the ongoing war for household loyalty. Score 1 for Team Dave. You'd think that after dividing our apartment like we were, negotiating the Treaty of Versailles, Claudia and I might have settled into some kind of Cold War détente where we just ignored each other's existence and went about our separate lives. You'd think that, but you'd be wrong, because apparently the universe has a sixth sense of humor and wasn't done watching our marriage implode in the most spectacularly petty ways possible. The next act in our domestic theater of the absurd began on a Wednesday morning when I discovered that one of my favorite shirts, a navy blue button-down that I'd worn to every job interview for the past month, had been transformed into what could generously be described as abstract art, and more accurately described as a crime against cotton. I found it in the dryer, which should have been my first clue that something was wrong since I'd specifically left it hanging in the closet the night before. But there it was, shrunken down to what might fit a middle schooler, with pink splotches scattered across it like someone had used it as a canvas for a finger painting class. "Claudia," I called out, holding up the remains of what had once been a perfectly respectable piece of clothing. "What the hell happened to my shirt?" She emerged from the bathroom, where she'd been applying her daily armor of makeup with the precision of someone preparing for war, and glanced at the shirt with the casual indifference of someone observing roadkill. "Oh, that," she said, returning to her mascara application. "I needed to do a load of whites yesterday, and your shirt was mixed in with my delicates. Unfortunately, one of my red scarves got mixed in too." One of her red scarves. Right. The same red scarf that had been sitting in our hamper for 3 weeks, because apparently washing scarves required some kind of specialized knowledge that I wasn't privy to. "So you ruined my shirt," I said, which seemed like a reasonable summary of the situation. "I didn't ruin anything," she replied with the tone of someone who'd clearly rehearsed this conversation in her head. "It was an accident. Besides, we're splitting everything 50-50 now, remember? Shared laundry facilities mean shared risk." Shared risk. She was talking about washing clothes like we were investing in cryptocurrency together. "This shirt cost me $40, I said. "And my scarf cost me $60, she replied. "So technically, you came out ahead in this transaction." Transaction. She was turning accidental clothing destruction into a profit and loss statement. I looked at the shirt again, then at Claudia, then back at the shirt. And that's when I realized that this wasn't an accident at all. This was psychological warfare disguised as domestic incompetence. Claudia had been doing laundry for 7 years without ever once turning my clothes pink. The woman could coordinate color schemes for entire rooms, but suddenly she couldn't separate reds from whites. But here's the thing about playing psychological warfare with someone who's been unemployed for 2 weeks and has way too much free time on his hands. I was about to become a master of the game. "You know what?" I said, folding up my ruined shirt with the calm of someone who'd just achieved enlightenment. "You're absolutely right. Shared facilities, shared risk. I totally understand." Claudia paused in her makeup routine, clearly suspicious of my reasonable response. She'd been expecting me to lose my shit, to yell and demand she replace the shirt, to give her ammunition for her inevitable "my husband is so unreasonable" conversation with her girlfriends over overpriced wine later that week. Instead, I walked calmly to my computer, opened up my accounting spreadsheet, which had grown significantly since that first night, and created a new line item. Property damage fee, $40. Due immediately. Then I did something that I was probably going to enjoy way too much. I sent her an invoice. Not just any invoice, mind you. A professional-looking invoice complete with my name at the top, an invoice number, itemized charges, and payment terms. I even included a late fee. If payment is not received within 24 hours, damaged shirt will be worn to all future social events, including but not limited to your company's annual charity gala. I printed it out, walked into the bathroom where Claudia was now applying lipstick, and handed it to her with the formal courtesy of a process server. "What is this?" she asked, though she was clearly reading it as she spoke. "Your bill for damages incurred during shared laundry facility usage," I said. "Payment can be made via Venmo, cash, or check. I've also included a late fee structure in case you need time to process the paperwork." She stared at the invoice, then at me, then back at the invoice. I could practically see her brain trying to process whether I was serious or if this was some kind of elaborate joke. "You're invoicing me for $40, she said. "Plus late fees if payment is delayed," I confirmed. "I figure if we're going to treat our marriage like a business partnership, we might as well handle disputes professionally." The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear Mrs. Chen's TV through the walls. Claudia looked like someone had just explained quantum physics to her in ancient Greek. Then, without saying a word, she pulled out her phone and sent me a Venmo payment for exactly $40 with the memo, "Laundry Incident Settlement." I nearly lost it right there. She actually paid the invoice. My soon-to-be ex-wife had just entered into a formal financial transaction over a ruined shirt, and somehow that felt like the most honest interaction we'd had in months. But if I thought that was the end of our escalating domestic arms race, I was seriously underestimating Claudia's capacity for creative retaliation. 2 days later, she needed to borrow my cufflinks for some work event. Apparently, her company was throwing one of those networking mixers where everyone pretends to care about each other's business cards while drinking wine that costs more per glass than most people spend on lunch. "Can I borrow your gold cufflinks?" she asked, and for a moment I thought we might be returning to normal human interaction. "Sure," I said, because despite everything, I'm not actually a monster. "They're in the jewelry box on my dresser." "Great," she said. "I'll need them for about 6 hours. What's your rental rate?" Rental rate. She was asking about rental rates for my cufflinks like I was running some kind of formal or lending library. "My what now?" I asked. "Your rental rate," she repeated with the patience of someone explaining a simple concept to a slow child. "If we're operating on a 50-50 business model, then personal property loans should be handled like any other transaction. I need to borrow your cufflinks, so I need to know what you're charging. I stared at her for a solid 10 seconds, trying to figure out if she was serious or if this was some kind of test to see how far I'd take our new arrangement. But she was looking at me with the expectation of someone waiting for a legitimate business quote. $50, I said, because if she wanted to play this game, I was going to play it like a champion. $50? For 6 hours. Plus a $200 security deposit, I added, warming up to the concept. Refundable upon return of the cufflinks in original condition. I'll also need to see 2 forms of identification and a credit card on file in case of damages. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again, and I swear I could see the exact moment when she realized she'd created a monster. Fine, she said finally, but I'm paying with a credit card, and I want a receipt. A receipt. Of course she wanted a receipt. Because at this point, why not turn our marriage into a fully documented business transaction complete with paper trails and accounting records? I wrote her a receipt on a piece of notebook paper. Received from Claudia Martinez, $50 rental fee, plus $200 security deposit for 1 pair gold cufflinks. Rental period, 6 hours. Late return fee, $25 per hour. Damage fees assessed at replacement value. She paid me via Venmo again, took the cufflinks, and left for her event. And you know what? I felt pretty good about the whole thing. $50 for 6 hours of cufflink rental wasn't bad money, especially considering I'd gotten them as a gift from my college roommate's wedding 5 years ago, and they'd been sitting in a box ever since. But here's where it gets interesting. Claudia returned the cufflinks exactly 6 hours later, in perfect condition, with a formal request for her security deposit refund. She'd even taken photos of the cufflinks before and after wearing them, just in case I tried to claim damages. This woman had turned borrowing jewelry into a full documentation process. She was treating our marriage like a rental car agreement. Your cufflinks, returned as agreed, she said, setting them on the kitchen counter along with a printed email showing the exact time she'd left the apartment and the exact time she'd returned. Security deposit refund, please. I inspected the cufflinks with the seriousness of a jeweler appraising diamonds, nodded approvingly, and refunded her deposit. Then I did something that I probably enjoyed way too much. I left her a Yelp-style review. 5 stars, I announced. Reliable borrower, returned items on time and in excellent condition. Would definitely rent to again. She actually laughed at that, which was the first genuine moment of humor we'd shared since this whole thing started. For about 30 seconds, it felt like we might be 2 normal people who'd gotten a little carried away with a silly argument. Then she asked if I wanted to grab dinner together, and I handed her a menu from the Thai place down the street along with a calculator. Sure, I said. Just let me know what you're ordering so we can split the bill appropriately. And don't forget to factor in tax and tip. I'm not subsidizing your spring rolls. The laughter died pretty quickly after that. But later that night, as I was updating my spreadsheet with the day's financial transactions, I realized something interesting. We'd actually had more honest communication in the past week than we'd had in the previous 6 months. Sure, it was all transactional and completely insane, but at least we weren't pretending anymore. We weren't pretending to be happy. We weren't pretending to be compatible. And we definitely weren't pretending that this marriage was anything more than 2 people who'd gotten really good at splitting expenses and really bad at splitting everything else. In a weird way, it was almost refreshing. Like finally admitting that your favorite restaurant has gone downhill, instead of pretending the food is still good just because you used to love eating there. I closed my laptop, looked over at Biscuit, who was sprawled across my half of the couch like he owned the place, and realized that tomorrow was going to bring some new ridiculous escalation in our domestic Cold War. I couldn't wait. I should have known that our little domestic experiment in advanced pettiness wouldn't stay contained within the sacred walls of our divided apartment for long. Word was bound to get out eventually, and when it did, it was going to come in the form of Hurricane Patricia, Claudia's mother, a force of nature disguised as a 62-year-old woman who wore pearls like armor and wielded guilt like a medieval battle axe. Patricia Martinez was the kind of mother-in-law who made grown men reconsider their life choices. She had that special talent that only comes from decades of practice. The ability to make you feel like you were failing at being human just by the way she looked at your shoes. I'd been dealing with her passive-aggressive commentary for 7 years, ever since Claudia and I started dating, and I'd learned to navigate her particular brand of maternal warfare with the careful diplomacy of someone defusing a bomb while blindfolded. But apparently, our new 50-50 arrangement had reached Patricia's ears through whatever mysterious communication network exists between mothers and daughters, the same network that allows them to share information faster than the CIA and with twice the accuracy. I was sitting in my designated half of the living room on a Thursday morning, enjoying a bowl of cereal that I'd purchased with my own money and prepared using my own labor, when I heard the unmistakable sound of Patricia's heels clicking down our hallway like a countdown timer to domestic destruction. She had a key, of course, because Claudia had given it to her years ago for emergencies, and apparently Patricia had a very broad definition of what constituted an emergency. The front door opened with the force of someone who had every right to be there and zero intention of asking permission, and Patricia swept into our apartment like she was conducting a military inspection. She was wearing one of her power suits, navy blue with gold buttons that probably cost more than my monthly unemployment check, and her signature pearl necklace that could have doubled as a weapon in the right circumstances. "David," she said, and just the way she pronounced my name made it sound like an accusation. "We need to talk." Now, here's the thing about Patricia. She'd never actually liked me. But for 7 years she'd maintained a veneer of polite tolerance because Claudia seemed happy and I hadn't done anything overtly terrible like gambling away our savings or getting arrested for public intoxication. But the gloves were clearly off now, and she was looking at me like I'd personally insulted the Pope. "Good morning, Patricia," I said, standing up with the careful politeness of someone who knows they're about to get lectured. "Claudia's not here. She's at work." "I'm not here to see Claudia," she said, settling into the chair across from me with the authority of someone calling a board meeting to order. "I'm here to see you. I want to know what kind of man makes his wife pay for her own coffee." Oh, so Claudia had been sharing the details of our new arrangement with Mommy Dearest. I probably should have seen this coming, but somehow I'd been naive enough to think our marital Cold War might stay between us. "The kind of man who believes in equality," I said, which was technically true and also guaranteed to make Patricia's eye twitch in that way that meant I'd just stepped on a conversational landmine. "Equality," she repeated, and I swear the temperature in the room dropped about 10 degrees. "David," I raised my daughter to expect a certain standard of treatment from her husband. A standard that apparently includes morning coffee and basic courtesy. Basic courtesy, right? Because nothing says courtesy like presenting your spouse with an itemized bill for shared Wi-Fi usage. "Patricia," I said, trying to keep my voice level, "Claudia and I have agreed to split our expenses 50-50. It's what she wanted. It's what she wanted because you lost your job and she's trying to be supportive," Patricia shot back. "But making her pay for coffee? Making her figure out that ridiculous machine every morning? That's not equality, David. That's punishment." I looked at Patricia sitting there in her designer suit, clutching her purse like it contained the nuclear launch codes, and I realized she genuinely believed that Claudia was the victim in this situation. In her mind, her precious daughter was being forced to endure the hardship of making her own breakfast because her unemployed husband had lost his mind. "Would you like some coffee?" I asked, because I'm apparently a glutton for punishment. "That would be lovely," she said, clearly expecting me to jump up and start the whole elaborate coffee preparation ritual that I'd been performing for Claudia for the past 7 years. Instead, I walked over to my computer, opened up my spreadsheet, and started typing. "What are you doing?" Patricia asked. "Calculating your guest services fee," I said without looking up. "Coffee preparation is $3.50, plus there's a guest surcharge for non-residents. Let me see. That brings your total to $5. Will you be paying cash or card?" The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear Biscuit's tail wagging against his dog bed in the next room. I looked up to find Patricia staring at me like I'd just announced I was joining a cult. "You're charging me for coffee," she said, and her voice had that dangerous quiet quality that mothers develop when they're about to unleash the full force of their disappointment. "I'm charging you for coffee preparation services," I corrected. "The coffee itself is an additional $1.50 per cup, based on current market rates for premium organic blends." I pulled out the laminated copy of our household usage agreement, the same one Claudia had presented to me like it was the Constitution, and pointed to Section 4.3, Guest Policies and Associated Fees. As you can see, I continued with the professional demeanor of someone explaining a cell phone plan. All household guests are subject to usage fees for services and amenities. Coffee service is clearly listed at $6.50 per cup, which includes preparation, serving, and cleanup. Patricia's mouth opened and closed like a fish trying to figure out how to breathe air. She looked down at the laminated document, then back at me, then down at the document again. This is, she started to say, then seemed to realize that finishing that sentence might involve language that wasn't appropriate for a woman of her social standing. Fair and transparent, I supplied helpfully, just like Claudia wanted. That's when Patricia did something I'd never seen her do in 7 years of family dinners, holiday gatherings, and passive-aggressive gift exchanges. She lost her composure completely. "Are you out of your goddamn mind?" she exploded, and hearing Patricia Martinez drop an F-bomb was like watching the Queen of England do a keg stand. "You're charging guests for coffee? In your own home." "It's not just my home," I reminded her. "It's our shared living space, split 50-50 according to a legally binding household agreement. And since you're on Claudia's side of the apartment, technically, she should be the one collecting the fees." I gestured toward the blue tape line that ran through our living room, and Patricia's eyes followed the path of masking tape, like she was trying to solve a puzzle that made no sense. "What is that?" she asked. "Property line," I said. "Claudia's half is on that side. Mine is on this side. Equal space, equal responsibility, equal financial obligation for all services rendered." Patricia stood up and walked to the tape line like she was approaching a crime scene. She looked down at it, then followed its path around the room, taking in the full scope of our territorial division. "You divided the apartment," she said, and I could hear the disbelief in her voice. "Claudia divided the apartment," I corrected. "I just made some minor improvements to ensure accurate boundary delineation." She walked over to the kitchen and saw our half tables sitting on opposite sides of the tape line, like some kind of modern art installation titled "The Death of Communication." "You cut the table in half," she said. "I moved my half of the table to my side of the apartment," I said. 50-50, remember? Patricia turned around and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, part horror, part fascination, and part grudging respect. "And Claudia agreed to this?" she asked. "Claudia designed this," I said. "The spreadsheet, the territorial divisions, the fee structure, all her idea. I'm just following the rules she established." I handed her another laminated document, Claudia's original proposal for household efficiency, complete with charts, graphs, and calculations that would have made an economics professor weep with pride. Patricia took the document and started reading, her expression shifting from confusion to comprehension to something that might have been suppressed laughter. "She charged you for Netflix?" she said. "Proportional usage based on bandwidth consumption and viewing hours," I confirmed. "And Wi-Fi?" "Shared infrastructure costs allocated according to individual usage patterns." Patricia kept reading, and I could see her maternal protective instincts warring with what appeared to be growing amusement at the sheer absurdity of what her daughter had created. "This is the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen," she said finally. "This is the most honest our relationship has been in years," I replied. She looked up from the spreadsheet and studied my face like she was seeing me for the first time. "You're enjoying this," she said. "I'm learning from it," I said. "Turns out when you treat a marriage like a business transaction, you discover some interesting things about your business partner." Patricia set down the spreadsheet and walked back to the tape line, looking at our divided living space with what I was starting to recognize as professional appreciation. She'd been married to Claudia's father for 38 years before he passed away, and she'd spent most of those years managing his various business ventures. She understood spreadsheets, territorial negotiations, and passive-aggressive warfare better than most people understood their morning coffee routine. "You know what?" she said finally. "I think I'll skip the coffee." She picked up her purse and headed for the door, then paused and turned back to me. "David," she said, and for the first time in 7 years, my name didn't sound like an accusation when she said it. "When this whole thing implodes, and it will implode, make sure you get a good lawyer." Then she walked out, leaving me standing in my half of the apartment with the distinct feeling that I'd just passed some kind of test I didn't know I was taking. About an hour later, Claudia called me from work. "My mother just texted me," she said without preamble. "She said you charged her for coffee?" "I offered her the same rate structure you established for household services," I replied. "She declined to pay." There was a long pause, and I could practically hear Claudia trying to figure out how to respond to that. She also said something about you showing her our spreadsheet. She asked about our arrangement, I said. I showed her the documentation you created to support it. Another pause, longer this time. What exactly did she say when she left? Claudia asked, and I could hear something in her voice that might have been worry. She recommended I get a good lawyer, I said. The line went quiet for so long that I thought she'd hung up. Claudia, I'm here, she said finally. I need to think about some things. After she hung up, I sat down at my computer and opened my spreadsheet. Under Daily Observations, I added a new entry, Mother-in-law visit. Unexpected ally. Results inconclusive. Recommend continued monitoring. Then I made myself a cup of coffee, my own coffee, prepared with my own labor, consumed on my own half of the apartment, and started planning my next move in what was rapidly becoming the most expensive game of chess I'd ever played. You know what they say about idle hands being the devil's playground? Well, whoever said that clearly never met someone with a college degree, a laptop, and enough pent-up marital frustration to power a small city. Because while Claudia was off at her boutique marketing firm teaching 20-something influencers how to authentically engage with their audiences, I was discovering that unemployment might actually be the best thing that ever happened to my creative career. It started innocently enough. After Patricia's surprise visit and her cryptic advice about lawyers, I found myself with even more free time than usual. I'd already sent out my daily quota of job applications to companies that would probably never call me back. I'd walked Biscuit around the block twice, and I'd reorganized my half of the apartment so many times that I could have qualified for a certificate in space optimization. That's when I stumbled across something that would change the entire trajectory of our domestic Cold War. The internet's insatiable appetite for relationship horror stories. I was browsing Reddit. Because what else do you do when you're unemployed and your wife has turned your marriage into a business transaction? When I came across a thread titled, "What's the pettiest thing your ex ever did?" The stories were legendary. People sharing tales of romantic revenge that ranged from mildly annoying to absolutely diabolical. There was the woman who replaced all her ex-boyfriend's shampoo with Nair. The guy who changed his Netflix password right before the season finale of his ex's favorite show. The couple who got into a bidding war over their own couch on eBay. And that's when it hit me. I was living in the middle of content gold. See, here's what most people don't realize about the internet. Everyone thinks they want to read success stories and inspirational content, but what they really want is drama. They want to rubberneck at other people's disasters. They want to feel better about their own relationships by watching someone else's marriage implode in spectacular fashion. And boy, did I have a marriage implosion to share. I started with a blog post titled, "My Wife Invoiced Me for Coffee." A modern marriage experiment. I wrote it in about an hour, just laying out the basic facts of our 50-50 arrangement with enough humor to keep it from sounding like a bitter divorce manifesto. I included screenshots of Claudia's spreadsheet, with names changed, because I'm petty but I'm not cruel, photos of our divided apartment, and a detailed breakdown of how we'd managed to turn basic household tasks into complex financial transactions. I posted it on Medium, shared it in a few relevant Facebook groups, and then forgot about it while I went to make lunch on my half table using ingredients I'd purchased with my own money. 3 hours later, I checked my phone and nearly choked on my sandwich. The post had gone viral. Not just popular, viral. Thousands of shares, hundreds of comments, and my inbox was flooded with messages from people who either thought I was a genius or thought I needed serious therapy. The comments section looked like a war zone between Team Dave, finally, a guy who stands up for himself, and Team Claudia. This man is clearly having a psychological breakdown. But here's the kicker. Sandwiched between all the relationship advice and amateur psychology was a message from someone named Jennifer at a website called relationshiprealtalk.com. She wanted to know if I'd be interested in writing a weekly column about my marital experiment for actual money. Actual money. For writing about the insane situation I was already living through. I called her back immediately, and within an hour I had my first freelance writing contract in 10 years. The pay wasn't going to make me rich, $200 per column, weekly deadline, 1,500 words minimum, but it was more money than I'd made since getting laid off. And all I had to do was document the ongoing implosion of my marriage with enough humor to keep people entertained. Talk about turning lemons into lemonade. That evening, when Claudia got home from work, I was sitting at my half desk. Yes, I divided that too, typing away on my laptop with the focused intensity of someone who'd finally found their calling. What are you working on? She asked, which was probably the first time in months that she'd shown any interest in my daily activities. Writing, I said without looking up from my screen. Writing what? A blog about our arrangement, I said. Turns out people find our situation pretty entertaining. She walked over to read over my shoulder, which was her first mistake, because what she saw was the draft of my second column, the spreadsheet of doom. When your wife treats marriage like a business plan. I watched her face go through about 6 different emotional stages as she read. Confusion, recognition, horror, anger, and something that might have been grudging admiration. You're writing about us? She said. I'm writing about me. I corrected. My experience with our new arrangement. All names have been changed to protect the innocent. There's nothing innocent about this, she said, gesturing at my laptop screen. You're making fun of me on the internet. I'm making fun of the situation, I said. There's a difference. And technically, since I'm the one doing the writing, and writing is labor, and we're splitting everything 50-50, you should probably pay me for half the time I spend working on this. The look she gave me could have melted steel, but she didn't argue with the logic, which I took as a small victory. How many people have read this? She asked. The first post? About 20,000 so far, I said, refreshing the page to check the latest numbers. And I just signed a contract to write a weekly column about our marital experiment for a relationship website. A contract? $200 a week, I said, and I couldn't keep the satisfaction out of my voice. Turns out there's a huge market for stories about couples who've lost their minds. Claudia stared at the screen for another few seconds, reading through the comments section where strangers were dissecting our relationship with the enthusiasm of sports commentators. This is insane, she said finally. This is income, I corrected, which means I'll be able to contribute more to our household expenses. In fact, if this column takes off, I might be able to cover my half of the rent without dipping into unemployment benefits. That got her attention. For all her talk about equality and independence, Claudia was a practical woman, and the idea of me actually earning money instead of just collecting government assistance was clearly appealing. What exactly are you writing about? She asked. Everything, I said. The spreadsheet, the territorial divisions, the invoice system, your mother's visit yesterday. It's all material. My mother's visit. Great content, I said. The readers loved the part about charging her for coffee. One guy commented that he's going to start charging his in-laws for Wi-Fi access when they visit. I showed her some of the comments, and despite herself, I could see her reading them with growing interest. There's something addictive about seeing strangers discuss your life, even when they're criticizing your choices. Look at this one, I said, pointing to a comment from someone called Married and Tired. Finally, someone who understands that marriage shouldn't mean one person does everything while the other person takes it for granted. And this one, I continued, scrolling to another comment. I showed this to my husband, and now he's doing his own laundry for the first time in 15 years. Thank you for the inspiration. Claudia read through more comments, and I could see the wheels turning in her head. She was realizing that our ridiculous situation had somehow struck a nerve with thousands of people who were apparently dealing with similar issues in their own relationships. They're taking sides, she observed. Yep, I said. About 60-40 in my favor, but there's a solid contingent of Team Claudia supporters who think you're a feminist hero for demanding equality. She scrolled through more comments, and I watched her face cycle through various emotions as strangers on the internet debated the merits of our respective positions. This comment says I'm a modern woman who refuses to be taken advantage of, she said. And this one calls me the most passive-aggressive husband in history, I replied. I'm kind of proud of that one. We spent the next hour reading through comments together, which was probably the most civil interaction we'd had since this whole thing started. It was weird, bonding over strangers' opinions about our failing marriage, but it felt more honest than most of the conversations we'd had in the past year. So what happens now? She asked finally. Now I write about whatever happens next, I said. The column runs weekly, so I need fresh material every 7 days. Fortunately, living with you provides plenty of content. She laughed at that, which surprised both of us. I can't believe people are paying you to write about our marriage, she said. Technically, they're paying me to write about the collapse of our marriage, I corrected. There's a difference. Is it collapsing? She asked, and there was something in her voice that might have been genuine curiosity. I don't know, I said honestly. But whatever it's doing, it's apparently very entertaining to watch. The next morning, I woke up to find that my second column had gotten even more attention than the first. My inbox was full of interview requests from podcasts, messages from other writers asking for advice, and what appeared to be a marriage proposal from someone in Ohio who thought my approach to domestic conflict resolution was revolutionary. But the most interesting message was from a literary agent in New York who wanted to know if I'd ever considered writing a book. A book about my marriage falling apart in the most methodically petty way possible. I was still staring at that email when Claudia emerged from the bathroom, already dressed for work and looking like she'd spent extra time on her makeup. "Good morning," she said, which was more civility than I'd gotten from her in weeks. "Morning," I replied. "Coffee's at Starbucks, as usual." "Actually," she said, pausing at the front door, "I wanted to ask you something." "What's that?" "If you're going to keep writing about us, do you think you could mention that I'm available for marketing consultations? You know, for your readers who might need help with their social media strategy." I stared at her, trying to process what she'd just asked. "You want me to include advertising in my column about our marital breakdown?" "Cross-promotion," she corrected. "It's just good business." And that's when I realized that Claudia hadn't just accepted our new arrangement. She was trying to monetize it. "I'll consider it," I said. "For the usual fee." "What fee?" "Product placement costs extra," I said. "I'm thinking $50 per mention, plus a percentage of any revenue generated from referrals." She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it, then opened it again. "Fine," she said finally. "Send me an invoice." After she left, I sat down at my computer and started typing my third column. When your failing marriage becomes a side hustle, a modern love story. I had a feeling this one was going to be my biggest hit yet. You know that feeling when you're watching a movie and you can see the plot twist coming from about 40 minutes away, but the characters on screen are still stumbling around obliviously while you're sitting there yelling at the TV? Well, that's exactly how I felt when I finally discovered the real reason behind Claudia's sudden enthusiasm for our 50-50 arrangement. It was a Thursday night, about 3 weeks into our domestic experiment in advanced pettiness, and I was sitting at my half-desk working on my latest column, How to Invoice Your Spouse, a beginner's guide to marital accounting, when I heard Claudia talking on the phone out on the balcony. Now, normally I wouldn't have paid much attention. Claudia was always on the phone with someone, her girlfriends, her mother, her co-workers, various service providers who needed to be reminded that yes, she did indeed want the premium package for whatever she was buying. But something about her tone caught my attention. She was using what I called her soft voice, the one she used when she was trying to be comforting or intimate, the voice I hadn't heard directed at me in about 6 months. I tried to focus on my writing, but the sound of her voice kept drifting through the sliding glass door. She was speaking quietly, almost whispering, which immediately set off every alarm bell in my recently developed paranoia detection system. I saved my document, closed my laptop, and did something that I'm not particularly proud of, but that felt absolutely necessary in the moment. I crept over to the sliding door and listened. I know, Claudia was saying, her voice soft with the kind of concern she used to reserve for me when I was having a bad day. "But you can't keep doing this to yourself." There was a pause while whoever was on the other end responded. "Marcus, listen to me," she continued, and my blood pressure immediately spiked about 40 points. Marcus. That was a name I hadn't heard in about 2 years, but it was definitely a name I remembered. Marcus Holloway, Claudia's ex-boyfriend from college. The guy she dated for 3 years before we met. The one she still followed on Instagram, despite my subtle suggestions that maybe staying connected to your ex-boyfriend wasn't the healthiest thing for our relationship. The same Marcus who had conveniently moved back to New York about 6 months ago after his divorce was finalized. "Don't cry," Claudia was saying, and I could hear that particular tone that women use when they're comforting a man they care about. "I'll figure it out, okay? We'll figure it out. We'll figure it out." Not, "You'll figure it out," or "Things will work out," but "We'll figure it out." As in, Claudia and Marcus, working together as a team to solve whatever problem, was making poor Marcus cry on the phone at 9:30 on a Thursday night. I stood there frozen behind the sliding door like some kind of suburban spy, my mind racing through all the implications of what I was hearing. How long had they been talking? How often did Marcus call her? And more importantly, What exactly were they planning to figure out together? I have to go, Claudia said after another few minutes. Dave's inside and I don't want him to. Yeah, I know. I'll call you tomorrow, okay? Dave's inside and I don't want him to what? Over here? Get suspicious? Find out that his wife was having intimate phone conversations with her ex-boyfriend while he was sitting 20 feet away updating a spreadsheet of household expenses? I heard her footsteps approaching the door, so I quickly scrambled back to my desk and pretended to be deeply absorbed in my writing. Claudia slid the door open and came back inside, and I could feel her watching me for a moment before she walked to the kitchen. "How's the article coming?" she asked, her voice perfectly normal, like she hadn't just been whispering sweet reassurances to another man. "Great," I said without looking up. "I'm writing about trust in modern relationships. Really fascinating stuff." I could practically hear her wince at that, but she didn't say anything else. She got a glass of water, said good night, and went to bed like it was just another normal evening in our increasingly abnormal living situation. But I sat there staring at my laptop screen for another 2 hours, not writing a single word, just thinking about Marcus and trying to piece together the timeline of when our marriage had started falling apart. The 50-50 arrangement suddenly made a lot more sense. Claudia hadn't been trying to create equality in our relationship. She'd been trying to create distance. She'd been trying to untangle our lives financially and emotionally so that when she eventually left me for her ex-boyfriend, the transition would be as smooth as possible. The spreadsheet, the territorial divisions, the business-like approach to every aspect of our domestic life. It wasn't about fairness. It was about making it easier to split up our assets when the time came. I felt like an idiot for not seeing it sooner, but I also felt something else: relief. For weeks, I'd been wondering if I was the asshole in this situation. Was I being too petty? Too passive-aggressive? Was Claudia right to demand more equality? And was I wrong to turn it into such an elaborate game? But now I knew the truth. This wasn't about equality at all. This was about Claudia preparing for her exit strategy while keeping me distracted with invoices and household usage agreements. The next morning, I started a new document on my computer. Not a blog post or a column, but something I titled Incident Report Log. Evidence of marital infidelity suspected. I know that sounds incredibly paranoid and possibly psychotic, but here's the thing. If Claudia wanted to treat our marriage like a business transaction, then I was going to approach the dissolution of that business with the same methodical attention to detail that she'd used to create it. Entry number 1. Thursday, September 28th, 9:30 p.m. Overheard phone conversation with Marcus Holloway. Subject used intimate tone, promised to figure it out together, and specifically mentioned not wanting husband to overhear conversation. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention to Claudia's behavior, and the evidence started piling up like snow in a blizzard. Entry number 2. Friday, September 29th, 11:45 a.m. Subject received text message while eating lunch, smiled while reading, then quickly put phone face down on table. When asked who texted, claimed it was work stuff. Entry number 3. Saturday, September 30th, 2:15 p.m. Subject went to grocery shopping for 2 hours, but returned with only a small bag containing items we already had at home. When questioned about long shopping trip, became defensive and accused me of micromanaging her schedule. Entry number 4. Monday, October 2nd, 7:20 p.m. Subject claimed she had to work late, but her company's social media accounts showed no evidence of evening work activities. Returned home at 9:45 p.m. with no explanation for 3-hour delay. I know this makes me sound like a crazy person, but I was actually starting to enjoy the detective work. It was like solving a puzzle, except the puzzle was my own life, and the solution was probably going to cost me half of everything I owned. The breakthrough came the following Tuesday. Claudia had gone to what she claimed was a client meeting downtown, but she'd forgotten to take her laptop, which seemed odd for someone who supposedly needed to present marketing strategies to potential customers. About an hour after she left, her phone rang. She'd left it on the kitchen counter, her side of the kitchen counter, technically, and the caller ID showed Marcus H. I stared at that phone for about 30 seconds, wrestling with the ethical implications of what I was about to do. On one hand, answering someone else's phone is a violation of privacy. On the other hand, if your wife is having an emotional affair with her ex-boyfriend while charging you for coffee, maybe the normal rules don't apply anymore. I answered the phone. "Hello. I said in my most professional voice. Claudia, Marcus sounded confused. You sound different. This is Dave, I said. Claudia's husband. She forgot her phone when she went to meet you. The silence that followed was so complete that I thought he might have hung up. But then I heard him take a shaky breath. Oh, he said. I wasn't. We weren't. Meeting. I supplied helpfully. Right. Of course not. I must have misunderstood when she said she had a client meeting downtown at the same time you happened to call. More silence. Marcus was clearly not prepared for this conversation. Look, Dave, he said finally, it's not what you think. What do I think? I asked, because I was genuinely curious to hear how he was going to explain this. I mean, we're friends. She's been helping me through my divorce, and I know it probably looks bad, but we're not. We haven't. Haven't what? Haven't done anything wrong, he said, but his voice sounded like someone trying to convince himself as much as me. Marcus, I said, settling into my recliner and putting my feet up, let me ask you something. When you call Claudia and tell her about your problems, does she tell you about our problems? Another pause. Sometimes, he admitted. And when she tells you about our problems, does she mention that she's currently charging me for household services and that we've divided our apartment in half with masking tape? She mentioned that you guys were going through some stuff, he said. Some stuff? I repeated. Right. Well, here's some stuff she probably didn't mention. I've been documenting our entire marital breakdown in a weekly column that gets about 50,000 readers. And Marcus? You're about to become a character in next week's episode. I could practically hear him panicking through the phone. Dave, please, he said. Don't drag me into whatever's going on between you two. I never meant for any of this to happen. Neither did I said. But here we are. Claudia wanted everything to be 50-50, so I guess that includes the blame for how this all turns out. After I hung up, I sat there for a few minutes thinking about what I just learned. Marcus wasn't some master manipulator trying to steal my wife. He was just a lonely, recently divorced guy who'd turned to his college ex-girlfriend for emotional support. And Claudia wasn't some scheming adulteress planning her escape. She was a woman who'd gotten so frustrated with our marriage that she'd started looking elsewhere for the emotional connection she wasn't getting at home. In a weird way, it almost made me feel sorry for both of them. When Claudia came home 2 hours later, I was sitting at my computer working on my latest column. She looked flustered, like someone who'd spent the afternoon having difficult conversations. How was your client meeting? I asked without looking up from my screen. Fine, she said, but she wouldn't make eye contact. Marcus called, I said casually. I let him know you'd forgotten your phone. She froze in the middle of taking off her jacket. You answer my phone? I answered our phone, I corrected. Remember? 50-50. That includes telecommunications equipment. She stared at me for a long moment, probably trying to figure out exactly how much I knew and how much trouble she was in. Dave, she said finally, I can explain. I'm sure you can, I said, still typing. But save it for the lawyers. I have a feeling we're going to need them soon. That night, I added a final entry to my incident report log. Entry number 7, Tuesday, October 10th, for 30 p.m., confirmed direct contact with Marcus Holloway. Subject's emotional affair officially documented. Recommend proceeding to Phase 2 of exit strategy. I closed the document, backed it up to the cloud, and started outlining my next column. When your wife's ex-boyfriend becomes your marriage counselor. A modern love triangle. This one was definitely going to be my most popular yet. 6 months later, I found myself sitting in a family courtroom that looked like it had been decorated by someone who thought beige was too exciting. The fluorescent lights hummed with the enthusiasm of a dying refrigerator, and the air conditioning was pumping out that special brand of recycled courthouse air that somehow managed to smell like disappointment and industrial-strength disinfectant. Claudia sat across the aisle with her lawyer, some hotshot divorce attorney named Harrison Blackwell, who charged more per hour than I used to make in a week. The guy looked like he'd stepped out of a legal drama. Perfectly tailored suit, silver hair that probably cost more to maintain than my car, and the kind of confidence that only comes from winning arguments for people who can afford to pay him obscene amounts of money. On my side of the courtroom sat Daryl Jenkins, my public defender turned divorce attorney who'd agreed to represent me after reading my blog and declaring it the most entertaining legal case he'd encountered in 20 years of practice. Daryl wore a suit that had clearly seen better decades, carried a briefcase that looked like it had survived at least 2 world wars, and had the kind of rumpled charm that made you think he might pull a miracle out of his coffee-stained sleeve. "Your Honor," Blackwell began, standing with the theatrical flair of someone auditioning for a courtroom procedural, "my client has endured months of psychological abuse disguised as financial accountability. Mr. Rodriguez has systematically tormented Mrs. Martinez through a campaign of petty harassment that includes, but is not limited to, charging her for basic household amenities, dividing their shared living space with tape, and publicly humiliating her through his so-called comedy writing." I had to give him credit. When you put it like that, I did sound like a complete psychopath. Judge Patricia Womack, a 60-something woman who looked like she'd heard every ridiculous divorce story ever invented and was thoroughly unimpressed by all of them, peered over her reading glasses at Blackwell's performance. "And what exactly is the plaintiff seeking?" she asked with the tone of someone who already regretted taking this case. "Full custody of the marital assets, Your Honor, plus compensation for emotional distress caused by the defendant's deliberate campaign of domestic terrorism." Domestic terrorism. I'd been upgraded from petty husband to domestic terrorist. That was definitely going in next week's column. Daryl stood up with the casual energy of someone about to demolish a house of cards. "Your Honor, if I may," he said, pulling out a 3-inch thick binder that I recognized as my complete documentation of our marital experiment. "Mr. Rodriguez didn't charge his wife for household amenities. He implemented the exact financial structure that she designed, requested, and formalized through written documentation." He opened the binder to Claudia's original spreadsheet, the one she'd laminated and presented to me like it was the Constitution. Mrs. Martinez created a comprehensive household usage agreement that specified exact costs for every service, amenity, and shared resource in their home. My client simply followed her instructions to the letter. Judge Womack took the binder and started flipping through pages of spreadsheets, invoices, and photographs of our divided apartment. "Mrs. Martinez," she said after a few minutes of reading, "did you or did you not present your husband with this document titled Proposal for Household Efficiency?" Claudia shot a death glare at her lawyer, who was clearly realizing that maybe he should have read the evidence more carefully before charging into court. "I did, Your Honor, but—" "And did you or did you not request that all household expenses be split 50-50 according to usage and benefit received?" "Yes, but I didn't mean—" "And according to this documentation, did you or did you not pay every invoice that your husband presented to you based on the fee structure that you established?" Claudia opened her mouth, then closed it, then opened it again like a fish trying to breathe air. "I did pay them," she admitted, "but only because—" Judge Womack held up her hand for silence and continued reading through my documentation. After what felt like an hour but was probably only 10 minutes, she looked up with an expression that might have been suppressed amusement. "Mr. Rodriguez," she said, "I have to ask, did you really charge your mother-in-law $5 for a cup of coffee?" "Based on the fee structure established by my wife, yes, Your Honor," I said. "Guest services were clearly outlined in Section 4.3 of the Household Agreement. And she paid it. She declined to pay, Your Honor, and left the premises." Judge Womack actually smiled at that, which I took as a good sign. "Your Honor," Blackwell interjected, "regardless of who created the initial framework, my client's intent was clearly not." "Mr. Blackwell," Judge Womack interrupted, "your client created a legally binding household agreement. Her husband implemented it exactly as written, and she paid every bill he presented. From where I sit, it looks like Mr. Rodriguez gave Mrs. Martinez exactly what she asked for." She closed the binder and looked at both lawyers. "Here's my ruling. Mrs. Martinez gets her half of the marital assets as initially requested. Mr. Rodriguez keeps the condo, since he's the one who's been paying the full mortgage for the past 6 months according to these records. And the dog goes to whoever actually feeds it." Biscuit, who'd been lying quietly at my feet throughout the proceedings, looked up and wagged his tail when he heard the word feeds. "That would be me, Your Honor," I said. "I've got the receipts." 8 months after Judge Womack handed down her ruling, I was sitting in my undivided living room. No more masking tape, no more territorial boundaries, just one normal apartment where a guy could walk from his couch to his kitchen without crossing international borders. The coffee table was whole again, the TV remote lived wherever I left it, and Biscuit had claimed the entire couch as his personal kingdom. My weekly column had evolved into a book deal, 50-50, how I accidentally turned my divorce into a business plan, which was currently sitting at number 7 on the New York Times bestseller list. Apparently, America couldn't get enough of stories about marriages that imploded in spectacular fashion while generating detailed financial documentation. The irony wasn't lost on me that Claudia's obsession with spreadsheets and accounting had ultimately made me more money than either of us had earned during our entire 7-year marriage. My publisher was already talking about a sequel, and 3 different streaming services had reached out about adaptation rights. I was halfway through a leftover slice of pizza, eaten on my own couch, purchased with my own money, with no invoices or usage fees involved, when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "How are you?" I stared at the message for a few seconds before I realized it had to be Claudia. She'd moved in with Marcus about 2 months after the divorce was finalized, and according to her Instagram, which I definitely didn't check regularly, except when I did, they seemed to be living their best life in his overpriced Manhattan apartment. I looked around my condo, our former condo, and considered how to respond. The place looked good. Better than good, actually. Without Claudia's constant redecorating impulses and expensive taste in everything, I'd managed to turn it into something that actually felt like home instead of a showroom for people with more money than sense. The 75-inch TV that I'd bought with my book advance dominated one wall. My recliner sat exactly where I wanted it, with a perfect view of both the television and the harbor. The kitchen table was a single, functional piece of furniture that could seat 4 people without requiring a treaty negotiation to determine seating arrangements. I typed back, 50-50. Half of me misses you. The other half is watching the game in peace. It was a lie, of course. I didn't miss her at all, not really. What I missed was the idea of what our marriage could have been if we'd both been different people. But the reality of Claudia, the spreadsheets, the constant dissatisfaction, the way she treated our relationship like a business merger that needed quarterly performance reviews, was something I was genuinely relieved to be rid of. My phone stayed silent after that, which was fine by me. I picked up the remote, my remote, from my coffee table in my living room, and flipped to the game. The Mets were playing the Phillies, and for once they weren't completely embarrassing themselves. Biscuit stretched out next to me, taking up about 3/4 of the couch, and I scratched behind his ears. "You know what, buddy?" I said, looking around the apartment that finally felt like it belonged to someone who actually lived there instead of someone who was constantly being evaluated on his domestic performance. Life's better when the receipts match the reality. Biscuit wagged his tail in agreement. Or maybe he was just hoping for pizza crust. Either way, it felt like the most honest conversation I'd had in years. My laptop was open on the kitchen table, displaying the first chapter of my next book, Single Again, a guide to reclaiming your space after roommate marriage. The early reviews from my editor were promising, and the advance was already more than enough to cover next year's mortgage payments. Outside, Brooklyn Heights was settling into evening. Couples walked along the promenade, probably discussing their own relationships, their own compromises, their own attempts to balance love and independence, and all the complicated mathematics of sharing a life with another person. I raised my beer bottle in a silent toast to all of them, hoping they'd figure out how to split things more equitably than Claudia and I ever had. Then I turned back to the game, put my feet up on my coffee table, and enjoyed the simple pleasure of not having to document a single moment of it.